The sunflowers were still blooming the morning Thomas Calloway died. Eleanor remembered that detail more than anything else. The way those bright yellow heads had swayed in the warm August breeze just beyond the kitchen window, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding inside. She had been boiling water for coffee when she heard the crack, not a gunshot, not thunder, just a sharp, ugly sound, like the world itself had snapped in two. She ran outside, coffee still in her hand, and found her husband face down in the dirt beside the old fence post he had been repairing. He was already gone by the time she reached him. Thomas Calloway had been a good man, not a great man in the way that men wrote about in newspapers or carved onto monuments, but good, quiet and steady. He rose before the sun every morning, worked until his hands bled, and always kissed Eleanor on the forehead before he slept. He had come west from Tennessee 6 years ago with $30, a borrowed horse, and a dream of land that was truly his own. He had found it here in the Kansas Territory, 40 acres of hard, stubborn earth that he had beaten into something resembling a farm through sheer force of will. He had died at 34 years old, leaving Eleanor with a 4-month-old daughter, a half-harvested crop, and the long, brutal Kansas winter bearing down like a freight train with no brakes. The neighbors helped at first. The Hendersons brought food. Old Silas Pratt helped stack the firewood. Even Marshall Dunnigan rode out from the town of Colby, 12 miles east, to offer his condolences and assure Eleanor that the community would look after her. But communities have short memories, and winter in Kansas has no mercy. By November, the help had dried up. The Hendersons had their own troubles. Old Silas had taken sick, and Marshall Dunnigan, Eleanor had come to understand, was the kind of man who offered help the way some men offered prayers, with great sincerity and absolutely no follow-through. By December, Eleanor was alone. The baby, she had named her Rose after Thomas's mother, was too young to understand any of it. She understood warmth and hunger and the sound of her mother's voice. She reached for Eleanor's face with tiny, perfect fingers and smiled with her whole body whenever Eleanor sang to her. And Eleanor sang constantly now, less for Rose and more for herself, filling the terrifying silence of the farmhouse with sound so she wouldn't have to hear herself think. The firewood ran low by the second week of December. The food stores were better. She had been careful, almost obsessive about rationing. But the cold was becoming something else entirely. It pressed through the walls of the cabin like a living thing. It crept under the door, slid through the cracks in the shutters, settled into the floor like it owned the place. Eleanor burned the extra chair first, then the old crate Thomas had used as a workbench, then the 2 wooden crates from the root cellar. She was down to her last 3 logs on the night of December 19th. She sat in the chair closest to the stove, Rose bundled against her chest, and stared at those 3 logs like they were the last 3 days of her life. Because in this cold, on this plain, they very nearly were. Outside, the wind was building. It arrived just after midnight. Eleanor had heard blizzards before, had lived through 2 Kansas winters with Thomas at her side. But nothing like this. This was not a storm. This was a verdict. The wind came screaming out of the northwest like something furious and ancient, throwing itself against the cabin walls with a violence that made the whole structure shudder. Snow drove horizontal through every gap and crack, dusting the interior sills white within minutes. The temperature dropped so fast, Eleanor could feel it happening, could feel the air thickening and sharpening around her, could see her breath in great white plumes even with all 3 logs burning. Rose woke screaming at 1 in the morning. Eleanor pressed her close, wrapped her in the only wool blanket they had left, and began to walk, just walk. Back and forth across the small cabin, humming, she had no voice left for singing, pressing the baby's face against the warmth of her neck, talking softly in a continuous stream of reassurance she wasn't sure she believed. "It's all right, little one. It's all right. We're going to be fine. We're going to be just fine." The last log burned down to coals at 2:30. Eleanor stared at the dying orange glow in the stove and felt something she had never felt before in her life. Not fear exactly, but a cold clarity worse than fear. a simple, terrible arithmetic. She had a baby. She had no fire. She had no neighbors within miles. She had no horse. She had sold Old Duke in October to pay for the flour and dried beans that now sat in the cellar. She could not walk 12 miles to Colby in a blizzard in the middle of the night carrying an infant. She could not leave. She could not stay. She pulled Rose tighter and sat down on the floor in front of the dead stove, pressing her back against its fading warmth, and began doing the only thing left to her. She prayed. Not the formal prayers she had learned in the little Baptist church back in Tennessee. She was past those. These were raw, unpolished things, barely words at all. More like a desperate reaching, a refusal to let go. Please, please, someone, please. Around 3 in the morning, Rose fell back into a fitful sleep against Eleanor's chest. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat in the freezing dark and listened to the storm rage, and she thought about Thomas, not with grief now, but with a fierce, almost angry love. And she made him a promise as the cold settled deeper into her bones. I will not let her die. I don't care what it costs. I will not let her die. She didn't know, sitting there in the dark, whether that promise meant anything at all. She had no plan. She had no options she hadn't already exhausted. She had nothing but the stubborn, irrational insistence that the story could not end here, in the dark, on this frozen floor. She didn't know, in the mathematics of survival, why that should matter. But she held on to it anyway. By 5 in the morning, the storm had not broken, but it had changed. The manic howling had settled into something steadier, colder, more purposeful. Eleanor had wrapped Rose in every piece of clothing she could find, her own coat around the baby's body, 2 wool socks on each tiny foot. She herself was in 2 shirts and a pair of Thomas's old trousers, shaking with a cold so deep it had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like something inside her was slowly switching off, circuit by circuit. She crawled to the door. The handle burned with cold even through her sleeve. She forced it open against the resistance of drifted snow and looked out into a world that had been completely remade. White, everything white, the sky, the ground, the air itself, all a uniform, blinding white, even in the pre-dawn darkness, the snow carrying its own dim luminescence. The fields had disappeared. The fence line had disappeared. Even the old oak 50 feet from the cabin door was just a vague dark shape, half swallowed by drifts. Eleanor pushed the door shut and leaned against it. Then she heard something, distant, almost certainly imagined. But she turned her head and listened with everything she had, and she heard it again, the faint rhythmic sound of hoofbeats. Coming from the west, moving through the storm like something he almost rode past. That was the thing that would haunt Eleanor for years afterward, how close it had come to nothing. How the difference between rescue and death had been nothing more than the direction of a horse's head. She had wrenched the door open and screamed into the wind. The sound was swallowed almost instantly. The storm took it and crushed it, but she screamed again and again until her throat was raw. She grabbed the iron pot from the dead stove and beat it against the doorframe, the metallic ringing lost in the howl of the wind. The dark shape on horseback had been perhaps 100 yards north, moving east, barely visible through the curtain of driven snow. She saw it pause, saw it stop, saw the horse turn its head. Then, slowly, it turned. He came out of the storm like something the plains had assembled from its own materials, dark coat caked with snow, hat pulled low, horse moving with the careful, deliberate patience of an animal that had been pushed hard and knew better than to rush. He rode straight to the cabin door without hesitation, as if he had always been heading exactly here. He pulled up 6 feet from Eleanor and looked down at her from under the brim of his hat. She couldn't make out much of his face, just dark eyes, a jaw rough with several days of beard, a long scar that ran from his left cheekbone down toward his chin. He was not a young man. Somewhere past 40, she guessed. He carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who had learned through long experience that stillness was a form of strength. He looked at her. He looked at the baby against her chest. He looked at the dead stove visible through the open door behind her. He swung down from the saddle without a word. "Wait!" Eleanor stepped back instinctively. She had no weapon. She had Thomas's old rifle, but it was unloaded and she had no shot. She had used the last of it in November trying to bring down a rabbit. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man held up one hand, slowly, deliberately, palm out. He reached into his saddlebag with the other hand and produced a wrapped bundle. He held it out toward her. "Firewood," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "Got a small supply tied to the pack horse. Your fire's out." Eleanor stared at him. "How did you know my fire was out?" "No smoke from the chimney." He nodded at the stack behind the cabin. "And it's 20 below. If your fire was going, you wouldn't be standing in the doorway." He waited. He didn't push forward, didn't try to move past her, just stood in the blasting cold with the bundle of wood in his hands and waited for her to decide. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Rose, whose tiny face was pinched and pale with cold. She looked at the dead stove. She stepped aside and let him in. That hadn't gotten the message about what this weather was capable of. She stood up straight. Rose stirred against her chest. "Someone's out there." His name, he said, was Cole Hadley. He said it the way some men say their names, flatly, without elaboration, as if it were simply a sound assigned to him and nothing more. Eleanor noted that he offered nothing else. No hometown. No explanation of what he was doing riding through a Kansas blizzard in the middle of the night. No story of where he'd come from or where he was going. She noted all of that and filed it away. But he built a fire with expert economy. 3 pieces of wood arranged with a precision that suggested long practice. The kindling placed just so. The spark caught on the second strike of his flint. Within 10 minutes, the stove was roaring with a heat so fierce Eleanor could feel it from across the room. She stood with Rose and watched the warmth spread through the cabin like a living thing reclaiming territory. She felt herself start shaking, not from cold, the shaking of released terror, muscles finally permitted to unclench. Cole Hadley unpacked his saddlebags with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to making camp in difficult conditions. He produced a small tin pot, a cloth bag of ground coffee, a piece of salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, and a flat tin of hardtack. He set water to boil without asking permission, which Eleanor would normally have found presumptuous, but found she lacked the energy to object to. "Eat," he said, when the salt pork was fried and the coffee poured. He set a tin plate in front of her and took his own to the far side of the room, settling into a crouch against the wall with his back to the corner. She noticed that. The way he chose a position with full sight of the door, old habit of a man who'd learned to always see what was coming. "You're not from around here," Eleanor said. "No." "Where are you from?" A pause. "West." "West is a big place." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Rose had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, the color slowly returning to her cheeks in the warmth. Eleanor watched Cole Hadley over the rim of her coffee tin. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at Rose. He looked at the door. "You're watching for someone," Eleanor said. He looked at her then. Those dark eyes were unreadable but not unkind. "Just a habit." "Men who ride through blizzards in the middle of the night aren't usually running towards something," Eleanor said. She was aware she was being bold, bordering on reckless. But she had nearly died tonight. Recklessness felt like a reasonable response. "They're usually running from something." Cole Hadley was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped and settled. "How long have you been alone out here?" he asked instead of answering. Eleanor felt the deflection and decided to allow it. "Since August, my husband died." "I'm sorry." It was only 2 words, but he said them in a way that made Eleanor believe he meant them, not as a social courtesy, not as a placeholder, but as something he actually felt. She studied him more carefully. The scar on his face was old, years old, not recent. His hands, she noticed, were scarred too, the kind of scarring that didn't come from farming. "What are you?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "I mean, what do you do? What are you?" He seemed to consider the question seriously, as if it deserved genuine thought. "I was a lot of things," he said finally. "I'm trying to figure out what I am now." Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood that kind of answer. She was trying to figure out the same thing about herself. Outside, the blizzard hammered the world. Inside, the fire burned bright and steady. And the two of them sat in a strange, careful silence, strangers bound together by weather and necessity, and the night moved slowly toward morning. The storm broke just before sunrise. Eleanor knew it by the change in the sound. The howling dropped suddenly to a low moan, then to a whisper, then to nothing. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, it felt almost sacred. She had dozed in the chair by the stove, rose against her chest, and woke to find the cabin warm and golden with firelight, and Cole Hadley exactly where she had last seen him, back against the wall, watching the door. She wasn't sure he had slept at all. "Storm's done," he said, without turning. "Yes." She rose carefully, settling Rose in the small crib near the stove. "You should sleep. If you need to, I'll be moving on shortly." Something about that landed hard in Eleanor's chest, which surprised her. She had known him for 5 hours. She had spent most of those hours suspicious of him. And yet the thought of him riding away into the white emptiness of the post-storm plains felt suddenly, unreasonably frightening. She moved to the window and looked out. The world was transformed, every surface laden with snow, the morning sky a pale and perfect blue, the plains stretching away in every direction like a vast white silence, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. And there, at the edge of her property, where the fence line had been before the snow buried it, she went cold in an entirely different way. 3 horses, standing at the fence line. 3 men on horseback, not moving, just watching the cabin. Mr. Hadley. He was already at the window beside her. She hadn't heard him move. He looked at the 3 riders for a long moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The only crack in that carefully maintained stillness. "You know them," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Are they the reason you were riding in the middle of the night?" "Partly." Eleanor's heart was hammering. "Are they dangerous?" Cole Hadley turned and looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. And she saw something in them that she hadn't expected. Not fear, not calculation, but something older and heavier. Something that looked remarkably like regret. "They're dangerous to me," he said quietly. "Not to you. They want me. Not anyone who has nothing to do with this. And if they come to this door?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll meet them outside. You're one man." "I've faced worse odds." The way he said it, calm, matter of fact, with no bravado whatsoever, was more frightening than any boasting could have been, because it sounded true. Eleanor stood very still. She looked at the 3 riders at the fence line. She looked at Cole Hadley. She thought about the night just past, the darkness and the cold and the prayer she had sent up from the frozen floor. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Rose. "Who are they?" she asked. He hesitated. Then, apparently deciding she deserved the truth, "Brothers, name of Crane, Frank, Delbert, and the youngest one, Boyd." A pause. "3 years ago I was a lawman, deputy U.S. Marshal out of Dodge City. I arrested their father for murder. He died in prison waiting for the trial." His voice was flat and even. "They've been looking for me ever since." "And you left the Marshal's service?" "After a while it seemed better to stop hiding behind a badge and just keep moving." He looked at her steadily. "I never meant to bring this to your door, Mrs. Calloway. I didn't know anyone was here. I saw your light through the storm and then I heard you." He paused. "I'm sorry." If you want me to ride out now and draw them away from your property, don't, Eleanor said sharply. He blinked. Slight surprise, the first real surprise she'd seen cross his face. Don't ride out, she said. They'll kill you in the open, you know that. She looked back at the riders. How long before they come to the door? He followed her gaze. They'll wait. Frank Crane is patient. He'll want me to sweat. He'll come at midday, maybe later. Try to catch me tired and off balance. Then you have time. She turned away from the window, straightening her spine, lifting her chin. And while you have time, you're going to help me think. He stared at her. Whatever he had expected from a widowed woman on an empty Kansas plain, it clearly wasn't this. I nearly died last night, Eleanor said quietly. I sat on that floor and I made a promise to my daughter that her story would not end here. That promise applies this morning too. Now. She met his gaze directly. What do we have to work with? Cole Hadley had a rifle, a Colt revolver, and 43 rounds of ammunition. Eleanor had Thomas's unloaded rifle, useless, a hatchet, a hunting knife, and a knowledge of her own land that the Crane brothers, coming from outside, could not possibly share. The root cellar, she said, drawing in the air with her finger as if sketching a map. It runs under the north side of the cabin, but there's an exit hatch in the barn floor. Thomas built it for exactly this kind of trouble. You can move between the cabin and the barn without going outside. Cole studied her. And the barn roof? Slopes low on the east side. A man could get up there and have a clear line of sight to the north fence. She paused. Thomas used to practice his shooting from up there. He said it was the best elevated position on the property. Something shifted in Cole's expression. A recalibration. He had walked into this cabin expecting to provide simple charity to a woman in distress. He was realizing, belatedly, that he had walked into something considerably more complicated and considerably more resourceful. The baby needs to stay in the cabin, he said. The baby will stay in the root cellar under the cabin floor, wrapped in everything I have. She'll be warm and she'll be safe. Eleanor's voice did not waver. I've already thought of that. You're not trained for a fight, Mrs. Calloway. Neither was I trained for farming 40 acres alone, or delivering my own child, or surviving this winter without my husband. Her voice stayed level. I learned quickly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something. All right, he said. Here's what we do. They spent the next 2 hours preparing with grim, focused efficiency. Cole moved through the root cellar tunnel to the barn, checked the angles, confirmed Eleanor's assessment of the barn roof. He came back through and helped Eleanor line the root cellar with every blanket and piece of insulating cloth in the cabin. They settled Rose down there, sleeping peacefully, warm and oblivious to the mathematics of survival being conducted above her head. Cole positioned himself in the barn, on the roof, with the rifle. Eleanor remained in the cabin, visible through the window, the appearance of a lone woman, alone, unaware. Bait, though Cole had used a gentler word for it. Frank Crane came at 2 in the afternoon, just as Cole had predicted. He came alone to the door, a lean, sun-weathered man with cold gray eyes and a thin mouth that looked like it had never learned the shape of a smile. His brothers held back at the fence line, covering the angles. Eleanor opened the door before he knocked, which clearly surprised him. Afternoon, ma'am. His voice was smooth, practiced politeness over something reptilian. Name's Frank Crane. I'm looking for a man who rode through here last night. Dark coat, dark horse, scar on his left cheek. I saw no one, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She was genuinely astonished at how steady it was. Frank Crane's eyes moved past her into the cabin. She saw them catalog the space. 2 coffee tins, 2 plates, 2 sets of tracks in the dirt floor. His eyes came back to hers. Colder now. Ma'am, I think the shot from the barn roof was a single, decisive crack. Boyd Crane, the youngest, who had been edging along the fence line toward the cabin's blind side, dropped his rifle and clutched his shoulder, his horse rearing away. Warning shot. Cole had aimed for the gun hand, which at 300 yards in post-blizzard light was a feat of marksmanship that required a moment to appreciate even in the midst of the crisis. Frank Crane went for his gun. Eleanor stepped back and slammed the door and dropped the iron bar across it in a single motion she had rehearsed in her mind a dozen times in the past 2 hours. She heard the shot impact the door, the wood shuddered, and she was already moving, down through the floor hatch, pulling it shut above her. She pressed herself into the corner of the root cellar beside Rose's sleeping form and listened to the world above rearrange itself. 3 more shots. A pause. 2 shots from a different direction. Cole had moved, she realized, was not where Frank Crane expected him to be. A shout, cut short, the sound of horses moving fast, then silence. A long, terrible silence that lasted approximately 10 years, as near as Eleanor could tell. Then Cole's voice, from directly above the hatch, "Mrs. Calloway, it's done." Delbert Crane was dead. Frank Crane had a bullet in his thigh and had been disarmed and tied to the fence post with his own rope, where he sat in the snow cursing with impressive creativity at no one in particular. Boyd Crane had fled east on his horse, clutching his wounded shoulder. Cole Hadley had a long gash along his left forearm where Frank's second shot had grazed him, and he stood in Eleanor's kitchen, allowing her to clean and bind it with the focused, slightly impatient air of a man who found having his wounds tended considerably more uncomfortable than receiving them. "Boyd will reach Colby by nightfall," Eleanor said, winding the bandage. "He'll bring the marshal." "That's all right." "Is it?" Cole looked at her steadily. "Marshal Dunnigan knows me. Knew me anyway. When he hears what happened, he'll likely put Frank Crane under arrest for the shooting at your property." A pause. "The Cranes have warrants outstanding in 3 territories. This'll put an end to it." Eleanor tied off the bandage. "And you?" "I'll give Dunnigan my account of events. He can wire Dodge City if he wants to confirm who I am." He looked at his bound arm, then at her. "I haven't done anything wrong in a long time, Mrs. Calloway. I'd like for that to start meaning something." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had appeared out of a blizzard and turned her impossible situation, by degrees, into something survivable. This man with his old scars and his careful stillness and his flat, honest voice. "Where will you go?" she asked. "After." "Don't know yet." He picked up his hat from the table. "West, I suppose. Still plenty of west left." "There's land available," Eleanor said. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. "South parcel, 40 acres. The man who was going to buy it from us, before Thomas died, he backed out. It's sitting empty." Cole Hadley went very still. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," Eleanor said briskly, feeling heat rise to her face. "I am suggesting that an experienced man, a man with good instincts and a straight shot, might find value in stable land, and that a widowed woman with a baby and 40 acres might find value in a neighbor who doesn't need 3 weeks' notice to be useful in a crisis." He looked at her. She looked back, chin up, refusing to be embarrassed by plain sense. "That's a practical proposal," he said finally. "I am a practical woman." A silence settled between them, but it was different from the careful silences of earlier. This one had a different quality. The quality of a door that had been opened and was waiting to see who would walk through it. "I'd need to see the land," Cole said. "Spring," Eleanor replied. "Come back in spring. The ground will be workable. You can look it over and decide." He nodded slowly. He put on his hat. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Calloway." "I'm a woman who intends to survive," Eleanor said. "I find that remarkable has very little to do with it." Something crossed his face then, genuine and unguarded, there and gone in an instant. She caught the edge of it. It looked like the kind of feeling a man has when he encounters something he had stopped believing in. He walked out into the white Kansas afternoon. March came in hard and left gently, which is the Kansas way. The snow retreated in stages, grudging and slow, and the plains emerged from beneath it the same color as new beginnings, a pale gold that deepened over days into the green of wild grass pushing up through winter-flattened earth. The sky returned to its proper blue. The meadowlarks came back. Somewhere in the south field, a family of prairie dogs re-established their town with an optimism Eleanor found personally inspiring. She was planting the first seeds of the kitchen garden, kneeling in the soft earth, Rose propped in a basket beside her, babbling happily at the sky, when she heard hoofbeats from the west. She didn't stand up right away. She pressed a seed into the dark earth, pressed the soil gently closed over it, and allowed herself a moment that she would never have been able to explain to anyone. A moment of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. For the earth under her hands, for the sun on her face, for the sound of her daughter's voice working out syllables that weren't quite words yet but were getting closer every day, for the fact that they were alive to see this morning. She stood up. Cole Hadley rode in from the west on a gray horse she hadn't seen before, leading a pack animal loaded with supplies. He looked the same, dark coat, hat pulled low, that particular stillness. But something was different, something around the eyes, some small easing, as if a tension he had carried so long he'd stopped noticing it had finally, partly released. He pulled up and looked at her. She looked at him. Rose made an imperious noise from her basket, demanding attention with the absolute confidence of a 9-month-old who has never yet been refused. Cole Hadley dismounted. He walked over to the basket and crouched down and looked at Rose with an expression that Eleanor would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not quite wonder, not quite recognition. It was something at the intersection of those two things. The face of a man encountering, unexpectedly, a reason. Rose stared up at him with her father's dark eyes. Then she reached up and grabbed his finger with her whole fist. Cole Hadley looked at that tiny hand wrapped around his finger, and something in his face gave way quietly, like ice in the first days of thaw. "The South Parcel," he said without looking up. "South Parcel," Eleanor confirmed. "Good growing land?" "Thomas always said so." He nodded slowly. He straightened up, but Rose held on. He looked down at her with a complicated expression, and she looked back at him with the serene authority of someone who has already made her decision and is simply waiting for the formality of agreement. Cole Hadley looked at Eleanor. "I'll need to know where the fence lines are," he said. "I'll show you," Eleanor replied, and they walked together into the Kansas morning, the woman who had promised not to quit, and the man who had ridden out of the dark to find that the thing he'd been moving away from all those years had simply been waiting for him to turn around. And the prairie spread itself out before them in the early light, vast and indifferent and full of everything a person might need, if they were willing to work for it and brave enough to stay. Behind them, in her basket in the soft spring earth, Rose Calloway sat in the sunshine and pulled up a fistful of new grass with the same fierce, irresistible grip she had used to hold her mother to the world on the coldest night of the year. And she laughed, the way only babies laugh, with her whole entire heart.